Hey, thanks, Reese. So hi, everyone. Thanks for inviting me to speak tonight. Hopefully it'll be interesting and exciting. So my name's Ben Fothergill. I run Sea Kayak Guides down in Pembrokeshire in the southwest of Wales. And I run the company with Nige Robinson and Martin Leonard. And we sort of specialise in bespoke guiding and coaching here. A bit spoilt, I think, in Pembrokeshire. I mean, I would be a bit biased, but I think it's one of the best places in the world to go sea kayaking. It's really amazing spot. So yeah, it's an interesting question that we were posed by Reese to come up with with an expedition and some learning points or thoughts, I suppose, about decision making coming from these expeditions. So I'm going to talk about an expedition I was lucky enough to go on two summers ago to the northwest of Iceland. So I've been lucky enough to go to Iceland twice, actually. The first trip we did was on the inside of Hornstandir, which is the bit I'm about to show you. And it's a stunning place to go, really, really incredible wildlife and quite a unique environment, very different to anything else we've seen. Righty-ho. So this trip was slightly different. So it was organised by John Carmody from Seacliff Kayakers and a local guide out in Iceland called Gudni Pal. I won't try and pronounce his second name because I'll just murder it and it's a bit rude. So lucky enough, I was able to go and work on this expedition with them. So it's right up in the northwestern tip of Iceland. So if you imagine the sticking out bit on the northwest, it's actually called Hornstandir, which means the horn. And we've got the really sticky out bit on the top of this map is the horn itself. No one actually lives out there now. So during the Second World War, really, it was the last time that anyone lived there. And it just became really tough for people to survive. So they actually left and returned to all the villages and the towns. Because overwintering here is pretty brutal. They get up to 13 meters of snow. And the summer kind of lasts from about June till August. So the rest of the time it can snow and be a pretty brutal place to try and exist. So yeah, it's a wonderful part of the world, a really special place to go. We were quite lucky in that the group that John had put together to go on this expedition was a group of pretty experienced paddlers. So we're talking about paddlers from sort of sea kayak leader up to advanced sea kayak leader ability level. And that gave us some leeway in terms of the decisions that we could make about where we're going to go. These people are competent paddlers, but they also had quite interesting goals. So the goals were decided way in advance of the expedition. So the main goals were to paddle as far around Hornstandir as possible, which is essentially the whole that top part of the map you can see, to experience wilderness and this beautiful sort of inhospitable place, to gain confidence in the expedition decision making and also skills, so just spending time out in these wild places and living there comfortably. But a big part of this was to gain enough experience so that they could go and do these sorts of trips themselves. And then the overall, I suppose, the most important thing really that came out of it was people wanted to have fun and they wanted to enjoy being there. They didn't want it to be a sort of route march around this beautiful part of the coast. It's a very complex trip and it's pretty committing. The first crossing you can see that I've drawn very badly across Ísafjörður. It was about sort of, if you go in a straight line, it's about 10 to 12 kilometers across. The full crossing all the way across to the far side would actually have been closer to sort of 20 to 30 kilometers. So a fair old crossing. Yeah, it's a big old space. And I think that's one of the main things that jumps out at you when you go to Iceland is the scale of everything. If you're used to paddling a lot in the UK, suddenly everything is really big. So each one of these fjords is huge. The crossings are huge. The cliffs are much bigger than you think they're going to be. We were lucky there was 3 guides on this trip and 6 clients. So a pretty good ratio of guides to client. And we had some anticipated decision-making challenges before we went. So some of the things that really sort of jumped out of us, there was the committing nature of some of the crossings. That was definitely going to be something to consider. Also, if you notice these large horn-like structures all the way around the coast, they're really big and they're very long and committing paddles. And once we started to research into these different headlands, you realize that you're sort of looking anywhere between 15 and 30 kilometers of pretty committing paddling, possibly no stopping zones or safe landing zones. So each one of those headlands was going to become a crux and a decision-making point. After the second day on the water, there won't be any weather forecasting, because this, as you can see from this line that went to our first campsite, that campsite really was the last place we had any phone signal or any contact with the outside world easily. So once we were committed into the trip, then we'd have to make decisions based on what we were seeing. And then also some remote forecasting that we were getting from different things I'll talk about in a bit. A lot of the beaches, once you're round from the main inland fjord, once you get round onto that northwestern side, they're exposed to surf and swell, and also lots of wind. So it's a very exposed coastline. There was no real hiding from anywhere. So we really had to make sure we actually had a proper window of weather. Otherwise, it was going to be a very limiting trip. The other thing we had to decide, I suppose, was how far towards the Horn. The Horn is the final of that big sticky out headlands over to the east. How far out towards the Horn were we actually going to try and go? Because if we had to paddle out and then paddle back again, that's pretty committing, because every one of those headlands could be a real barrier to getting back. So that was a really big question point, I think, before we left. And I suppose the other one was how much of the decision making we were going to hand over to our group. Because essentially, one of the main goals of this expedition was for them to be making decisions and to build on their decision-making ability. Obviously, fundamentally, the responsibility came down to myself, John, and Goodney. We were responsible for the group in that environment, but we felt quite strongly about passing on the decision-making ability to them as much as possible. Great. So they were sort of some of the main challenges that we'd identified before we went. But a lot of these questions we couldn't really answer until we're actually there doing the expedition or on the water. But what we could do is inform ourselves as much as possible before we went. So we gathered as much information as possible. Luckily, John Carmody and myself have paddled pretty much with all of the people on the trip before. So they were a known quantity. We knew where their ability level was, and we knew what they were capable of. So that takes away a big question mark, I think, on any of these sorts of trips. Local input, as Nick talked about, we're pretty spoiled, aren't we, in the UK and in the States? Well, actually, lots of places in the world. I won't just get those two on the list. So Nick's lucky in that he had the Admiralty charts, he had pilotage books, he had all sorts of information. Iceland, we didn't have quite as much. So we've got these really good maps, topographic maps. The charts were not quite as useful. So we did actually have charts of the area, but most of the charts around these northwestern headlands were unsurveyed. So within about sort of a mile of the coast, nothing surveyed. So it kind of limits its usefulness when we spend most of our time in that sort of inshore zone. And there's very little tidal information. So the only information we could find was the very northern headland, you can see there at the top of the chart, the map, was called Stromnus, which is essentially, that means strong current. And we found some information that was indicating there might be up to 2 or 3 knots of current around that headland. So, but that was about it. That was pretty much all the information we could find. What we did have, though, was these topographic maps, and the topographic maps can give you an awful lot of information. So as you can see, well, you can't really see because they're really zoomed out, but I'll describe them for you. Each one of those headlands has almost sheer cliffs going from approximately 500 meters straight into the sea. So really spectacular structures, but not always the best places for trying to land at any point. So I think this is a point that Nick was talking about briefly, was deciding on those safe zones, those beaches in beforehand. So we were doing the same thing, but maybe just on a larger scale. You know, from these maps, you could highlight possible landing spots, and then you could highlight definite landing spots. But yeah, it was an interesting process, and it definitely gave us at least a rough plan beforehand. Rockfall was definitely going to be an issue. You could tell this from the topographic maps, but also we had our local guide on the ground, Goodney. So we talk about gathering information. The best way to gather information is to speak to someone on the ground who's lived there their whole lives and worked there. So Goodney was a wealth of knowledge. And he's one of the few people who's paddled out here more than once, essentially. And yeah, so for the information we gathered from him, it was really, really obvious that a lot of these headlands would be dangerous places to stop. Rockfall is quite a common occurrence along this stretch of coastline. The local weather patterns are pretty hard to study in advance, but we did know, for instance, you can get katabatic storms, and generally we're affected by weather coming off the Greenland ice cap and the North Atlantic. So hopefully they would be predictable, maybe in some ways, but you never know, do you? It's a big question mark, definitely. We were able to sort out the ability for a whale watching boat to actually come and pick us up. So this was a huge weight off our minds. Essentially, this boat had agreed to pick us up from different points along the trip. So this took out a huge part of that commitment factor, because it meant whatever happened, we had a backup. So if we couldn't paddle back, or we decided we didn't want to paddle back, we had the option of someone coming to pick us up. So it was kind of a big deal, really. And then obviously we'd organised to have a pre-trip meeting in Easterfjord, which is the local town, a few days before leaving, where we could sort of check on equipment and all this sort of stuff. Yeah, so it's good. It's a really interesting process working up towards it. I think it's important to remember that we couldn't answer a lot of these questions. There was an awful lot of information that we didn't have. We gathered as much as we could, but all of these things we were going to have to keep our minds open and just make decisions as we go. So day one, right from the start, we were very, very keen that the group decides whether we went on the water every day. So this was not going to be an expedition just led by John, myself and Goodney. It was going to be a group process, and through the week we tried to hand over more and more of that decision-making responsibility to the group. So on the first day, we decided we had a pretty favourable weather forecast. We had maybe force 2 to 3, and very little tide in the fjords itself. So everyone felt confident that we could do the crossing. And this was a bit of a shakedown day, really, to see how the boats reacted, how they behaved. You know, a lot of people haven't paddled fully loaded expedition boats before. So this is a real opportunity to get used to that different cadence of paddling that you might need to do. If you notice down the bottom of the map, there's a little headland just before you commit to the overall crossing. This is quite nice. It gave people a little opportunity to warm up, and then we had a stop, a quick bite to eat, and just sort of checking in, really, making sure everyone was happy with decisions and that everyone was happy to go still. So we went through it. We did the crossing. We had an amazing encounter halfway across with some humpback whales that came and visited us and just swam around the kayaks for a bit, which obviously made the trip a little bit longer than we'd previously planned, but you have to stop for whales. And then you notice there's a little kink in the line on the far side. That was pretty much the only safe landing spot on the far side of the fjord. It's a really, really stunning stretch of coastline, but nearly all of it you're exposed to rockfall. So we really had to hunt for those little spots. So we found this one little spot where we were protected essentially by the streamline that came down the headland. And at this point, we had to make a decision whether we were going to carry on to a previous campsite, or whether we were going to do another crossing, which would put us in better stead ready for the next day. So the group themselves decided that everyone's feeling good. We'll carry on to Sletta, which is the next little headland across the bay. So there we had. The first night was a beautiful night. Our local guide Goodney had cooked an amazing lamb in an earth oven. So you dig a big hole in the ground basically and heat up some rocks and then cook the lamb over heated rocks. It was pretty special. So day 2 started. We made a process, and something we've always tried to work on is really reflecting on the previous day's decisions and how people felt. So this became part of our morning meetings, I suppose. Every morning we would sit down and reflect on the previous day's action. And I suppose the big decision on this point is, do we go or do we stay? Because once we've gone around this big headland, sort of maybe 15 kilometers of that southwestern facing headland, it's really committing. We're into the main part of this headland, and we might actually get stuck there if the weather turns. So this was our last opportunity to get up-to-date weather forecasts. So we got as many pressure charts as we could. We got as many different forecast apps updates as possible, and we saved all that stuff because we knew over the next couple of days we'd probably have to call back on it. What was informing our decision, I think, was really important. Everyone was really motivated to get going. Absolutely everyone. We all wanted to make it to the Horn, but that's not necessarily a good enough reason to make a decision about going around a very big committing headland. So we had to make the decision based on what we could see. And we actually had a pretty favourable forecast. There was very little swell. So everyone felt pretty happy about making that decision. Again, this was the team's decision, not our decision. Everyone was made that together. So off we went. And what we decided we'd do is we'd have different points along the headland that we'd make decisions about whether we're happy to carry on or not. And so we had 2 or 3 spots along the headland. There was actually one spot that you could stop that was safe. But again, we didn't know that until we actually started going out there. So it was one of those questions of having to go and try and find safe venues to stop at. It all went swimmingly though, and we paddled all the way around the headland and then made this amazing crossing over to a beautiful camp spot. The camp spot, again, was a possible crux for us because these beaches are all quite exposed to the North Atlantic and the Arctic Ocean. So they can get quite a lot of surf breaking onto the beaches. So, this again, it's quite a committing thing, isn't it? As we were coming around that first headland, we had to decide whether we're happy to commit to doing almost the same distance again across a bay to land at a beach where there may be surf. Having said that, we hadn't experienced any swell that day. There wasn't any swell in the forecast. So we all felt pretty happy with the information we had to go for it. Wild bits of coastline. Hopefully it gives you some idea of what you're looking at. I mean, as you can see, a lot of the boulders along the bottom, you could land there if you absolutely had to. It's just you're really exposed to what was above you. I don't know if you can make out in this picture, a lot of the white stuff is seabird poo. It was absolutely incredible. I've never seen seabirds like it. I mean, we think we have lots of seabirds in Wales, but Iceland was a different level, really spectacular. So we had this, a beautiful campsite on this really quite special place. This is about 3 o'clock in the morning. I got to go to the toilet and there was this amazing rainbow that was just lighting up the headland we just paddled around, actually. So that's the headland in the distance. That's about 10 kilometers away, to give you a bit of scale. So day 3 started with reflections on the previous day and obviously just looking at the forecast and trying to decide what was going to happen to us. As you can see, there was a low on its way towards us, which was, is definitely making us feeling a little bit anxious. So up-to-date weather forecasts were a bit tricky by this point. So we were looking at what was going on around us and trying to sort of feel out what was going to change. This was a tricky decision-making point. So the headland that we were about to go out to was Stromness, which was this tidal headland. And we really didn't know what to expect there. So there was a large amount of uncertainty in all of our minds. We were pretty sure we weren't going to see some sort of 8-knot raging tide race, but we really didn't know whether it would be 1 knot or 3 knots. And to complicate the decision for that day, we had a force 3 to 4 wind. So most people, or hopefully some people would know what a force 3 to 4 wind would look like, and that's reasonably paddleable in. But then if you add maybe 2 or 3 knots against the force 3 or 4 wind, that can create some slightly more challenging conditions. Not necessarily unpaddleable, but definitely could be more challenging. So there was a bit of uncertainty before we left that day. But the group came up with a plan. They decided that they were going to approach with caution. So they felt comfortable enough to paddle out towards the headland. If the conditions weren't suitable, we'd turn around and paddle back to our beach. They were more than happy to do that. And they also had looked on the map and highlighted a few spots where we could actually stop and make some decisions. So those safe zones, picking out those safe zones in advance. They'd already sort of come up with a bit of a plan, I suppose, for approaching that possible crux of the trip. At this point as well, the group had started to play with the idea of different leadership techniques. So by this point, myself, John and Goodney had pretty much stepped back from sort of instigating the decision making and trying to leave it up to the team to come up with plans every day. And they'd started to come up with a system. So on this day, they decided they were going to have a designated leader. So the group nominated a leader within their amongst themselves, and that person was supposedly in charge and deciding what they were going to do. So we made our way out to Stromness, and there was current, but nothing very exciting. So maybe 1 or 2 knots. And it was really quite a unique place. There's this one lonely little lighthouse stuck out on this crazy bluff, basically facing out into the Arctic. And it was a pretty wild and slightly lonely place. We did manage to find somewhere to land, but it was a great big boulder beach with a bit of swell. So then that had its own decision making that came into it, because we are in a pretty remote setting here, and trying to land heavily loaded boats on a beach with swell, you're increasing the risk, aren't you, of something happening to someone or a boat. And it's not quite the same as breaking a boat just around the corner from a harbour if you're 3 days into a wilderness trip. So we did consider it long and hard, and there were safe zones to land in, so we did. And the group again managed it perfectly. The front leaders of the group had decided that they were going to maybe nip through some rocks that were washing around the place. And it led to a really interesting discussion. So the decided leader for the day was too far behind to really be involved in the decision. And it was illuminating, I suppose, and interesting for everyone, because at the time the rock hop didn't look very exciting. It was just essentially a swelly rock with a little channel through the middle. But once we expanded on that risk versus reward in this sort of environment, some really interesting discussion came out of it. And we all decided that possibly rock hopping in a fully loaded expedition boat on a 20-kilometre stretch of committed coastline might not be the best bet. And so we went around. We carried on to the next campsite. That night, it was quite interesting, because there was discussion within the group about the possible breakdown of communication in that situation. So having a single leader where the group is spread out has its limitations and can be quite challenging if it's not managed appropriately. So one of the questions we posed to them is it essential that there is a designated leader for the day? Can we all be leaders, especially in a group of, I suppose, quite similar ability levels and similar mindsets, and I suppose similar aspirations? So it was a really interesting process. We had a tricky landing that evening, because there's a fair bit of surf by this point on this little beach. It wasn't a hard landing, but it definitely, you need to think about where you're putting yourself and the boat. Again, even just small surf makes landing in expedition boats really quite a trying process, I think. So the next day, this is the landing that we made. There's not much surf in that picture, but the next day we woke to a change in conditions, and I was really upset I didn't have a surfboard at this point, because it was a really pretty point break, and I imagine if it was bigger it would be really quite something to see. So the 4th day, we woke to really strong gusts rattling our tents, and by this point, myself, John and Goodney had a bit of a chat early that morning about the weather conditions, because we were probably getting gusts of maybe force 5, force 6 coming down off the hills behind our campsite. And force 5, force 6 in open water is a pretty committing place to be. We were pretty sure it was katabatic winds. So we were pretty sure that the winds were getting accelerated as they came down the hillside, because of really cold, dense air. But we couldn't be sure. You don't know, do you? It was what we thought was going on, but we had some uncertainties definitely in our minds. Again, this was down to the group. So the group had a morning meeting. They discussed the plan for the day, and they actually came up with some really good options. But the main option being that they were going to stay put for the time being, which I think was a totally fair enough proposal for the weather conditions. You can see it's actually quite a short distance from where we were out to the end of the headland. And the wind was from the northeast. It was forecast to be force 3, but we were definitely getting force 5 gusts coming down off the hillside. So it was a substantial difference between the forecast and what we're seeing on the ground. And uncertainty like that always sort of makes you sit up and take notice. So we spent a lot of time talking about different options, and the group decided they were going to sit tight for a few hours. So that's what we did. We hung out and went for walks and read some books. And in the end, the group came up with a new plan. They were pretty confident that it wasn't getting worse. It wasn't easing off either, but it wasn't getting any worse. And after studying the maps, they decided that you could make your way out to the headland quite safely using safe zones along the way, little bays, and really have a look at the conditions off the end of the headland. So if their hunch and our hunch was right, that it was katabatic winds, hopefully on that sort of leeward side off the end of the headland, the wind wouldn't be very strong. But if we got around there and it was force 5 blowing up against these great big cliffs, we weren't going to commit to 15 kilometers of a lee shore in force 5 winds. It was a good decision, and it was well thought out. And they came up with a clear process of when and how to make those decisions, so there wouldn't be any ambiguity when we got to the headland itself. So off we went, and luckily for us, it was exactly as we thought was going on. And the wind was a lot less once we got around the headland. It was still choppy and lumpy, but it was a lot friendlier than force 5. So we carried on along our way. Interestingly, towards the end of this long stretch, this actually rose up to 600 meters. The mountains between our campsite and the north side of this headland were about 600 meters high. And it was very misty, so you couldn't see much of what was going on. It was really atmospheric. And I suppose we kind of relaxed a little bit after the tension of the morning, trying to make the decision about whether we should go or not. And as we were cruising along, we tried to keep this rule of staying about 50 to 100 meters away from the coast on these really steep sections, just because they're steep and things fall off them occasionally. And as we were cruising along in the mist, we heard a sound like a jet engine, and turned around to see behind us huge lumps of rocks, or car-sized lumps of rock, and crashing into the sea. So it definitely made us all sit up and reevaluate I suppose our approach to how far we're staying off the coast. I think we did a really good job of it most of the time. Did we do it all the time? I don't know. I think that's something that we'd all have to reflect on, probably. It was definitely an eye-opening experience. So we moved on. I'm going to move through these a bit quicker because I'm talking lots. Really beautiful campsite as we got further along. Again, no surf beach, so would have been tricky in any sort of swell. And I think we were already aware of this, so the whole time we're sort of poring over weather charts and stuff like that, trying to predict whether any sort of swell was going to be coming our way. By this point, we were so committed into the trip. We didn't have any sort of radio signal or mobile signal, but we did have a Garmin InReach. So I know this is one of the questions that someone posed. What sort of equipment do you take with you on these expeditions? I mean, PLB is a wonderful piece of the kit, but it's a single direction of communication. So if you press the button on the PLB, someone will come looking for you, hopefully, but you have no idea if they're coming, and you can't communicate with them. So definitely worth taking as an emergency precaution. But the Garmin InReach that John had meant that we could communicate really well with the outside world. So we were getting daily updates on weather forecasts. Obviously not maybe at the level or the sort of, the detail that we might have wanted, but overall we're getting pretty good information about what was going on with the weather. So that made a big difference to, I suppose, help us make these decisions. They were hard decisions to make sometimes about whether we should and shouldn't go. So this was the campsite we made it to. The next day we woke up to strong winds, force 5, and really cold and wet. And the group by this point I think they'd almost they weren't involving us so much in the decision making. They were just making the decisions before we got a chance to chat with them, which was great. And they made the decision that day that they wanted a rest day. They wanted to sit it out. No one really fancied paddling into a force 5 headwind. So we spent the day here just exploring and fishing. It was an amazing little river with sea trout and Arctic char. Really beautiful spot. Quite cold though. Definitely made you realise you're just below the Arctic Circle. A couple of degrees and raining, and pretty chilly generally. And then so it led on to day 6 now. We're really getting into the expedition. And by this point, we set off pretty early in the morning. Again, the crux on all of these days were these headlands. What was the conditions going to be like on the headland? What were we going to see? And what could we try and predict? And the lovely thing is each one of these headlands were building our situational awareness. So the first headland, I don't think anyone really knew what to expect. Some of us had an idea in our minds, a picture that had been drawn, but every day, every experience was getting built upon. So this quite unique environment was suddenly becoming, I suppose we were getting more used to it, and we were becoming a bit more in tune with what was going on. We had a small surf to launch to in the morning, but really nothing to write home about. And the group now was moving as a really smooth decision-making team, essentially. Stuff was being discussed, particularly sort of the conditions were continuously being discussed, what people were seeing, what people were feeling, how they felt about the trip. And this actually turned into a really spectacular day. The sticky out headland at the top there was just full of kittiwakes. I've never seen so many kittiwakes. And they're just streaming along the coastline, again in really dense mist. And then we landed in the very far north in Hornvik, which is a really beautiful bay and quite a popular bay for hill walkers. So it's the first time we really saw other people in any sort of number, I suppose. And Hornvik is right next to the Horn itself, which is the really famous bit. And we were greeted by lots of Arctic foxes and all sorts of beautiful stuff. So the last 2 days really were spent really exploring the Horn area and Hornvik itself. But for me, the last day was probably one of the most, informative. The group decided they wanted to paddle around the Horn, see how far we could go around the Horn. And I don't think myself, John, or Goodney even really said anything in the decision-making process. I don't think we just sort of sat back and let the group come up with a plan. And it was really impressive to see. They had predetermined decision-making points. So they'd already decided before they got on the water where they were going to make the decisions. They decided how they were going to make the decisions. They decided also on how to make decisions if communication became tough, so they couldn't talk to each one another. So they had a whole range of hand signals. And we paddled around the headland, and it was quite bouncy, exciting, beautiful, really stunning scenery. And they moved perfectly as a team, and it was really quite impressive to see. They made the decision probably a few kilometers around the Horn that they were going to turn around, and they all did a little signal to one another, which was replicated, and we turned around and came back. And I think it was a really fulfilling part of the expedition for myself and for John and Goodney, just to see the team having essentially evolved into this really tight expeditioning crew that were helping each other and thinking about one another and making really sensible decisions. A few reflections on the trip. We tried to front load the decision making as much as possible. So a lot of that information could be gathered weeks and days and sometimes years in advance. But all that stuff was there. It was pre-thought about and considered before we actually made decisions. We made a conscious decision to arrive at camp early each day and factor in late starts. And this was done basically to provide time for reflection, but also time to make decisions. And it was an invaluable thing to do. The fact we had extra time in the calendar, so we had extra days, took away any sort of pressure from that thought and that feeling of we have to get on the water today. And there was a few times where we decided not to go to sea, and it was the right decision because they were not good days to go to sea. We ran through possible outcomes, and that became really important for the team. So quite often we would talk about different options before we got on the water. So by the time we got to any of those, I suppose, serious decision making, the heavy lifting of the decision making had already been done. It had been discussed and pre-thought about. So it really, yeah, it took a lot of pressure off people. I think the group itself was central to the whole expedition. Who you decide to go with, making sure they have the same aspirations, making sure you could communicate and have empathy for one another, I think is so important if you're going to go out on some of these big, exciting expeditions. We were really lucky with our group. They gelled brilliantly, and they worked seamlessly as a team. Towards the end, it wasn't always seamless, but yeah, it was. They were brilliant. Having everyone involved in the decision making really makes it so much easier if everyone understands why decisions are being made and how they're being made and are part of it. Then there's going to be a lot less conflict. Situational awareness was discussed continuously. So the whole time people are talking about what they're seeing, what they're feeling, and that just helps build this picture and allows us to predict what might be happening or what could happen around the next corner. Group size is super important. We're really lucky we didn't have a very big group. And I think the bigger the group you have, sometimes the harder decision making can be. And sometimes that group decision making might falter a little if we have a really big group. Some of the questions that came away from the trip were, does a group need to have a designated leader? Or can the group decide together as a whole? And it was really interesting process watching the group work this out for themselves. We had six people in our group, so nice small compact group. Reflecting every day on the experience, I think, is absolutely essential. If you don't reflect, then you're not learning. And if you're not learning, then you're just going to make the same mistakes over and over again. And I have to say, for me, probably the biggest, I suppose, the biggest thing really was that last day. Seeing the group operating in the way they did was really spectacular, and it was a fitting end to a really special trip. So yeah, it's a wonderful place. If you ever get the opportunity to go to Iceland, I would strongly recommend it. It's wonderful. I think that's probably enough, Reece, otherwise I'll keep talking forever.
Before we jump into other bits and pieces, it's nice to think about how both expeditions and that sort of things, how things kind of tie together regarding that whole process really. So we've got the big aims from both of you really, and having they're gathering information, looking at guidebooks, looking at charts, looking at maps, looking at locals as well to try and gather that information from them, thinking about the weather aspects, so getting things in advance as well as then on the day, how we can kind of make our plan as we're going along, building a team that's going to be working together as an essential kind of part, and those set agreed aims, just to make sure that everyone's on the same page and everyone kind of has an idea of where we're going and what we're doing, and having that time to think about processes. A lot of the time we have to make decisions on the hoof kind of thing, and as things are developing in front of us, but we've also got some time factored in to be able to actually think about things. And yeah, just thinking about what kit you were taking for the job. So making sure, as you mentioned with I forget the name of the Garmin device, but just being able to call out and that sort of things to get the information across, which you wouldn't carry in certain places, but having it out there made the whole process that much easier. So it was great how things kind of tie together from both expeditions, very different expeditions, very different processes. But as far as the decision-making process and how that ties together for both trips, it was really great to hear that.
But yeah, I have to say Garmin InReach was absolutely amazing. And I would strongly recommend it to anyone that's going to anywhere where there might be question marks over getting hold of people. There's been a couple of very good articles about PLBs and Garmin InReaches and stuff like that in emergency situations. And yeah, I would definitely say having the ability to be able to contact and communicate with the emergency services is an absolute must, really, I think, in these remote environments. So I would say having a satellite phone or an InReach or something like that is definitely the way to go. So sadly, actually, one of my trips was going to be the same as one of Nick's. So I won't bother repeating it. It was one of the Scottish Islands. So yeah, my I suppose the of course, I'm going to be biased, and that's been clarified now by Nick, backed up by Nick Cunliffe. I'm going to put that in a quote somewhere on the website, that Pembrokeshire is the best place in Wales to go sea kayaking. So yeah, I am very biased, surrounded by amazing places to go. So the first trip I would say is circumnavigation of Ramsey. It's just one of the most amazing places to go and sea kayak. You have everything you could possibly hope for. You have surf beaches, you have tide races, and stunning island with huge cliffs and lots of seabirds and seals and all sorts of other amazing wildlife. Crazy tidal flow stuff that's really quite challenging to anyone of any level. The caveat being this is quite a committing trip. So if you're unsure of the tidal sort of information stuff, then drop someone a line or give us a call and we can chat with you about it. You can come back up through Ramsey Sound, past the bitches, which aren't as terrifying as everyone makes out that they are. They can be really fun and playful. They're great places to go and have a good time and test your skills. And then you can pop back to White Sands. Equally, you can come the other way, but this is the sort of scenery you'd hope to see. This is the very southern tip of Ramsey. It really is a wild place. We actually look at Twtledillyn, which is you can just see some white water coming out of Twtledillyn. It's a tidal anomaly because it actually flows west for 9 hours and east for 3 hours. So it goes against all the rules. It's a great place to go. So my other trip is definitely a very committing trip, one that needs to be undertaken in the right conditions, but that would be a trip out to South Bishop, which is the little island down in the bottom of the screen. It's actually not that far offshore, but it feels like it's a long way offshore. And it really is a test of all of your seapersonship skills. You really need to understand what's going on with the currents, with the tides, how it's going to affect you. You can have up to 6 knots of current running between the Bishops and Clarks and Ramsey on a spring tide. So it's definitely somewhere that you need to know what you're doing, and if you miss it, you're going a long way out to sea. So it's quite a committing place to go, but one of the most amazing islands you can go to, I think, in the UK, probably. Definite trip worth doing. And if you time it right, you can come back into Ramsey just as the sun's going down, and it truly is one of the best days of sea kayaking I think you can have. Right, so on to slightly bigger trips. This is it's not circumnavigation. It's the coastal strip of Pembrokeshire. And this can be done in a really short amount of time or over a week or more. It's entirely dependent on how quickly you want to do it. I've just highlighted some red bits, and they're essentially the bits where you might have a bit more of an interesting time. So they're like the crux points, I suppose, on the coastline. But if you start at Cardigan up in the north and make your way all the way around to Amwath in the south, you will see such an array of coastal habitats and changing landscapes. It's amazing. It really is. That the northern coast of Pembrokeshire is really rugged and really quite different in character to that southern strip. The other added bonus to the southern strip is it's very remote, it's very committing, there's nowhere really to land, and there's also an MOD firing range, so you always have the added spice of getting shot at with tanks and guns, but one of the most amazing trips to do, really, really spectacular. And then we're moving on to Scillies. The Isle of Scillies really are, I think, quite unique in the UK because they just don't feel like you're in the UK. It feels like you're on some sort of Atlantic paradise. So they're stuck right down off the southwest of Cornwall, and you can catch a ferry out. You can pay just to put your boats on the ferry, or if you're feeling a little bit more adventurous, you can do the crossing out there. It's quite a full-on crossing though, lots of shipping and some quite interesting currents moving around Land's End. But the islands themselves, almost like an atoll, I suppose, because you can catch the ferry into Hewtown, which is on the main island of St Mary's. And this inner bit of the island is called the Roads. The central bit is almost like an atoll in the tropics. So it's semi-protected by the island surrounding it. So it's a really good place to pretty much guarantee that you better go out for a paddle somewhere. Even in some pretty scruffy weather, you can have a really good time exploring the islands. Each of the islands is really interesting. It's not a wild camping spot, so it's not somewhere that you could go and just wild camp wherever you want. All the islands are inhabited pretty much, apart from the Eastern Isles. But there are loads of campsites, so you can plan essentially an expedition around the islands using the campsites on the islands. Not a huge amount of current, maybe 2 or 3 knots of current is the most you can expect, apart from 1 or 2 little bits down at St Agnes where you can get a bit more flow. But really spectacular. It's basically a granite tor that sticks out of the Atlantic, and it's quite unique, I think, and a really wonderful place to go paddling. So there's some top choices for me.
Happy days, that's awesome. That's given me anyway a few places that I definitely need to be going to and want to be paddling out to, and just say thank you to you guys, and that might be us, I think, for this evening, really.